Yeah, so I'm David Shaffer. I'm the Policy Director for the Minnesota Solar Energy Industries Association. I figured what I'd do is, this is a PowerPoint I put together for some of the legislators up at the Capitol, sort of outlining sort of the basic fundamental aspects of solar policy in Minnesota. And then at the end, I have a couple slides as to sort of what's going on in relation to these various topics. I thought this might be a good way to get you guys familiar with some of the primary concepts that make solar work here. So I also figured it might be a good idea to learn about the different market segments within MnSEIA. So as sort of a general overview, we have our rooftop solar in the state. As I'm sure many of you have seen, there's a whole bunch of rooftop installations. I think there's even one here. And the rooftop isn't just about putting them on a house, they're also about commercial installations as well. And so that comes with a whole different supply chain, actually. A bunch of different products are involved in a commercial installation. And then there's sort of like hybrid programs in our state where it's sort of combination commercial or residential rooftop. And then we also do a lot of community solar garden work. How many people have heard about community solar gardens here? Okay, so a lot of you. And so a community solar garden program is basically a way to do rooftop solar, but far away from your house. You pretty much buy like a share or subscription in a garden that's somewhere else, usually not on your house. It can be, and occasionally is, on a commercial rooftop space. You can have small community solar gardens, but they're typically, at least in Minnesota, out on the fringes of Xcel service territory. Then there's utility scale solar, and so there's a couple different ways that you can see utility scale solar. I think the big one we have here is the North Branch project. It's about 800 acres of solar panels up in North Branch, and that was installed last year. Those are more like, instead of a coal plant or a natural gas plant, you might have a giant solar array as sort of an offset for those. And then there's still other projects too that are kind of more unique. So as far as residential rooftop goes, the way that it is usually incentivized is through something called net metering. So who's heard of net metering? Okay, I'm glad I'm doing this. So it is a weird concept, and I know a lot of people shy away from it, but it generally works like this. So when you buy energy, your meter spins this way. Well, when you produce energy with a solar array, it starts to spin the other direction. And at the end of the month, whatever you have left over is what you have to pay. The question is, what happens if you actually supply more to the grid than you use on site? What do you get paid? And that's something called average retail rate. And so that is pretty much equivalent to the retail rate that you buy your energy at. It's a little bit less, but generally pretty close. And you can, in Minnesota, no matter where you are, you can install up to 40 kilowatts of solar capacity and have it be net metered. That's the current law. And in Xcel service territory, you can now go up to, I think, 100 kilowatts of capacity. So one thing to note is this is a very contentious issue around the country. A lot of utilities don't like it. And one of the big reasons why they don't like it is utilities' business models are based on kind of two primary things. The first is your monthly charge. So every month you guys have to pay some amount of money to the utility just to be hooked up. Then the other way they make money is from their energy sales. And so how much energy you use also gets tacked on. And that's why in the winter, typically your energy bill goes up, even though in the summer, you might not even turn on your lights, but you'll still have to pay that minimum monthly charge. Well, if what you're doing is putting a solar array on your house, you are basically taking away the utility's ability to charge you for that revenue, for the energy that you're supposed to be purchasing from them. Since you're no longer purchasing from them, they're basically losing a customer. I didn't say that flawlessly, but you get the idea. And so they don't like it, especially utilities that have very few people in their service territory and utilities that have a long line extensions between customers. And so, to give an example, in Xcel service territory, it's a lot of the metro area. There's a whole bunch of people in a metropolitan area. You don't have to run that many lines out. But in a farm area, you have a bunch of lines out to each individual farm area. And that's expensive. And so utilities want to make sure that they don't lose any revenue because that's so expensive, and because every lost customer to net metering is potentially lost revenue for them. So some states are just trying to ban it outright. In our state, there's been a push this year, and it's really started in 2015, where the cooperative utilities have sought to add a fee to people who want to do net metering out in their service territory. And this fee is, in my opinion, comparable to the amount of money the utility is losing from the customer net metering. And so over the last 2 years, we've pretty much been trying to, sue them, for lack of a better word, at the Public Utilities Commission to try to reduce the fees. And they've gotten kind of sick of it. So this year they're coming around and they have a bill that I'll talk about a little bit more later, that is designed to exempt them from the Public Utilities Commission's jurisdiction. So what we did is we found a customer who was getting assessed this fee, and I represented him at the Public Utilities Commission, which is kind of like a courtroom. And the commission said, oh wow, we'll take a look at this fee. Well, before the commission's had an opportunity actually to look at it, the co-ops are trying to get this bill passed to say that the commission can no longer look at it. So that's kind of a problem. So then, sorry, this font's a little small here. There are some residential rooftop programs that are incentives for it. So not every utility does dislike solar. Excel has something called Solar Rewards. It's a basic incentive program, and recently Minnesota Power started its Solar Sense program, which is pretty similar. It's just a little incentive for about $7.50 per kilowatt, I believe. So then one other thing that's kind of in the news lately is PACE financing. So this is a way to finance your solar array, and it can be residential or it can be commercial industrial, and it's based on sort of an assessment that you pay off to your city. So they give you kind of a loan, and we have commercial industrial PACE in state now, and we've been trying to get a residential PACE market started. However, there was a push also in this legislative session to put our residential PACE program on pause while we put some consumer protections into place. Now, I am all for consumer protections. However, I believe this is actually just a veiled attempt to make sure residential PACE never actually gets started. One of the things with residential PACE that people don't like, especially if you're a bank, is that it puts your mortgage, it becomes the first priority over your mortgage. And so you'll be having to pay your PACE loan back before your mortgage. And so they obviously don't like that, because if somebody defaults on their home, they might not get paid out. So that's really what this is about. Anyways, so then commercial industrial also has net metering. It's very similar, except the only difference is if you want to do sort of a larger system, you don't get average retail rate, you get something called avoided costs, which I'll touch on later. And then also with this, we're working on a new thing at the Public Utilities Commission called, well, maybe it's not new, it's actually really quite old, but it's being revised in such a way that it'll be more applicable. It's called a capacity credit. And basically, a solar array produces a whole bunch of different benefits, but the number one more like quantifiable benefits are energy, which you usually measure through net metering, and then capacity, which is more like power. And the capacity credit's a way to try to value the capacity that the solar array is providing. And once you get to have large enough systems, the capacity becomes a pretty reliable and beneficial asset to the grid. So this is under Excel service territory. We're trying to push it out to all the other rate-regulated utilities. So that's Minnesota Power, Otter Tail Power, and Dakota Electric. And this, in my opinion, isn't an incentive at all. It's actually just compensation for the value that these systems are providing. So I'm hoping that this is kind of the frontier, and hopefully when we get this, it will like make the commercial rooftop industry in state explode. So then moving on to the Made Minnesota program. So this is a very maybe contentious program. In fact, it's probably the most contentious solar program in our state right now. So the idea of Made Minnesota came out of this 2013 legislation. And I don't want to get into the politics of it all, but basically the idea was that if you would build a solar panel in Minnesota, your customer would get a rebate amount associated with it to try to offset the panel price so it could compete on a global scale with other panels. So it's really expensive to build a panel in Minnesota, and without a rebate, the panels you couldn't sell them because the Chinese market is so, they can put out panels at such a low rate right now. So the idea was to try to incentivize manufacturing in state by providing enough incentive to compete with the Chinese panels. This program is now heavily under attack at the legislative level, in part because some of the manufacturers have had some challenges in the process of this. One went out of business earlier this year, and another one just announced this week that they were also going out of business. So in lieu of this, we are expecting that this legislative session will result in a different, hopefully a different rooftop program that somehow still ensures that people that were installing using this program can be made whole. Because that's one of the things about it is, even though it's been flawed from a manufacturing sense, and that's even only partly true, because some of the manufacturers that have moved into state to work on this have actually been really great companies, and they might lose out because of this. But one of the biggest boosts about it is it's really helped the installation community. We have a whole bunch of different companies that have risen up to take advantage of this program, and they've installed 5 megawatts each year of rooftop solar, and this year they're about to install about 10 megawatts. So it's really going to be a significant loss if this goes away entirely, but hopefully some of the money will just be reallocated to something else. So then moving on to community solar, there's different types of community solar garden programs in state. There's Excels, which is the biggest by far. This program is uncapped, and so if somebody wants to make a community solar garden, they can. And originally, you could make community solar gardens that were 5 megawatts. And so I keep talking about megawatts. I think maybe the best way to think about a megawatt is for each megawatt, it's about 5 to 8 acres of solar panels. And so these were about 40-acre gardens that were being installed. And then after a whole bunch of applications came in, the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission said, you know what, we're only going to allow you to do up to 1 megawatt of community solar. And at the time, it was under something called the applicable retail rate, which was a very financeable number for these gardens. It was a very financeable rate. Now it's transitioned to something called the value solar rate, which is a scientifically derived rate that's designed at capturing the true value of solar to the utility, society, and the ratepayers. The problem is it's not the most financeable of rates. And so since we've transitioned to 1 megawatt caps at the value solar rate, we've actually only had one application for community solar gardens come in. And so one of our probable legislative campaigns next year will be to try to alleviate that in some form or another. Because at the moment, it appears that program will have a huge amount of gardens that were initially applied for be installed this year and next year, and then we're unsure what happens after that. Moving on, we have Minnesota Power's community solar garden program. So I think Minnesota Power saw all these ratepayers in Excel super excited about community solar garden program, and they decided to do their own. They, however, did not want it to be uncapped like Excel's. They wanted to have total control over it. So they decided that they would build 1 megawatt of community solar, and then another 40 kilowatt community solar garden array by their offices, so they would appear to be very solar friendly. And then after some work at the Public Utilities Commission, we were able to open the program up to 4 megawatts. So we were able to quadruple it. And then the last thing to mention is there are a lot of cooperative community solar gardens. So even though the co-ops frequently push back on rooftop solar, they do tend to like community solar gardens, and because they are producing the power that they can then sell to the customers, they're never going to lose their customers because they're able to keep control over how it's distributed, and so and whatever types of payments setup they want to do. So you do occasionally see community solar gardens out in co-op territory. So then moving on to utility scale. So like I mentioned, that North Branch project was 100 megawatts, so 800 acres. We have another project down by Marshall that's a 62 acre or 62 megawatt project. Then there's the Aurora project, which is 100 megawatts or so that's distributed into 10 different areas, I believe. So there's about 10 megawatts each. And then some of the other investor-owned utilities have their own projects. There's a really cool 10 megawatt project up by Camp Ripley that's kind of like almost like a microgrid, sort of like the first steps towards one, which is pretty neat. And so kind of what makes utility scale projects work is usually they're done like this, through a competitive bid process. So the utility says, I want 100 megawatts of solar. Give me the cheapest price for it. And then every one of the developers will submit their cheapest price, and whoever's really the lowest will win, and then that's what will get installed. This is a good way for the utilities to work because they make sure they get a least cost option. It's good for ratepayers, but from our perspective, it's not the best for the solar industry because it makes sure that 100 megawatts is really just assigned to one company. And then maybe that company will contract with some other people. So it does have some supply line benefits, but we'd much prefer a more distributed approach to it. So another way you can do it is from avoided cost pricing. And so every utility has to have an avoided cost number. And so what avoided cost is it's basically a rate that is, if the utility were to purchase energy from like a natural gas plant or a coal plant, what would they buy it from? Because they don't want to have to pay a premium for energy produced from a solar array or a wind turbine. And so you can just always set one up as long as it's less than 80 megawatts, and they'll have to pay you for that. And then I guess one of the questions I get is, so why do utilities decide that they suddenly want 100 megawatts of solar? Well, sometimes it has to do with a renewable energy standard. And so we have a 10%, well, a 1.5% solar energy standard right now in the state. And I think it's a 10% goal. And so the idea would be that 1.5% of Excel's power must come from solar. And in order to do that, they have to do these competitive bids to make sure that they actually get the solar. So that's why renewable energy standards are so great, is because even if solar isn't the cheapest option, which one day soon it should be, it still encourages the utilities to procure it. And then you can even have like subsections of renewable energy standard. So there's the broad renewable energy standard, then there's the solar energy standard. Then we also have something called the small scale solar energy standard. So this is for systems that are 20 kW or less. And 10% of the solar energy standard, of the 1.5%, must come from 20 kW systems or less. Now this is kind of another legislative issue. Otter Tail and Minnesota Power are seeking to expand the size this year of the small scale carve out from 20 kW to 40 kW. This is kind of an interesting issue. We've remained neutral on it because they've argued that it will actually encourage them to do more solar up there. So we're hoping that's the case, and I guess we'll see. So then there's some other issues that we care about that we deal with periodically. So electric vehicles. Now we don't exactly represent any electric vehicle companies, but why we care about this is the more electric vehicles, the more demand there is on the utility grid, the more energy they need, and the more they'll likely turn to solar. So because of this increased demand on the grid, the more opportunity we see to get solar out there. Then we're also working a lot on energy storage. So one of the things that makes solar such a challenging thing to advocate for is that it is an intermittent resource. So what that means is sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. This is the same for wind. And you do generally need to have some level of baseload power. So baseload is typically coal or gas, and what that means is that you can just make sure it's on and running. Or it could be nuclear as well. And so having these baseload powers is really great and necessary right now. What energy storage does, though, if you can provide enough energy storage on the grid, you can basically turn your intermittent resources into baseload power. And so that we're expecting will be 5 to 10 years down the line. We're already seeing it a lot in California. It's too expensive at the moment, especially based on Minnesota's energy prices, but we are expecting it to come soon. Solar thermal, there's other types of solar. It's not just those photovoltaic arrays that you see up on the roof. It can be heating systems. There's also passive solar. I think at the start, solar thermal was kind of leading over photovoltaics, but with the decreased price of natural gas, it's really made them sort of fall out of favor, because in general, you want them for heating, and if natural gas is just so cheap, then you're going to go that way. And also, I've heard that there's some challenging aspects of maintenance and upkeep with them. And then another thing that I do want to touch upon is the solar renewable energy credits. This is an issue that we're always working on, and it plays in a lot. So a renewable energy credit is basically a way to track how much of your power is coming from renewable energy. So once an electron goes onto the grid, you don't know if it's powered by solar, powered by coal, or what. And so SRECs are a way for a utility or some company to talk about how they're powered, I guess. So every megawatt hour of energy produced results in one SREC, especially if it's from, one REC. If it comes from solar, then it results in one SREC. And if you were to sell that SREC to a company, they could say that they're powered by renewable energy. And so one of the challenges we have in our state is that even though we have these renewable energy standards, we don't have any alternative compliance penalties. So our utilities are gathering all these RECs, but if they don't get them, there's nothing that harms them. And so right now, our RECs are really cheap because nobody really wants them. But this does provide sort of an interesting opportunity for people like yourselves. If you wanted to go on the SREC market, you could buy an equivalent amount of SRECs as the energy you use, and then you could say that you are powered by solar. So that's kind of an interesting market, and you can also, a lot of other states drive up their SREC prices by adding an alternative compliance penalty and saying to the utility, if you don't buy all these RECs, you're going to be hit with a huge fine, and then suddenly those RECs become a lot more valuable. So I touched on the value of solar. This is another piece of work that we've been using. Now it's only in that community solar garden context. And again, it sort of takes that avoided cost and stacks additional values on top of it to basically outline the value that the solar provides to the utility and ratepayers and society as a whole. One of the big wins we had too with the community solar garden program up in Minnesota Power's territory is we forced them to publish their rate. And up there, it's like 12 cents levelized, which is really quite high. And you could, if they were required to actually pay it, you could have a really robust solar program up there based off that price alone, and that would have no impact on ratepayers, which would be very exciting. So then these are some other stuff. I'm just going to skip over that and talk more about the legislative session, which I think is why you guys are here. So I wanted to touch on all those concepts so we could have sort of a robust conversation about what's going on today. So the way the legislative session works, and this is my first year sort of being the lobbyist up on the hill for our association. So I'm going to tell you everything I've learned. Everything starts off kind of like this. There's a whole bunch of bill ideas. You have to go in and testify about them. Then Those bill ideas occasionally can get sent up to the governor just as a one-off, but they're typically bundled until the end, and then they're put together in something called an omnibus bill. And they do this because there's some stuff in the omnibus bill the governor really likes, and there's some stuff in there that he doesn't like. But because he has to pass it because of the stuff he really likes, they get away with a lot of these poison pills. So this session, we've seen all sorts of different things come through. So maybe I'll start with this one. So this House File 234, this was the co-op bill that I mentioned earlier. This was, initially what it said is that the co-ops were just not going to be regulated by the Public Utilities Commission at all. The fees, they could be whatever they wanted. Whether or not the customer had any sort of dispute resolution options was at the utilities control. They could do whatever they wanted with interconnection costs. And so an interconnection is you take your solar array, you click it up to the grid. Sometimes there's some sort of cost associated with it. Well, the co-ops wanted to decide what that cost was and make it whatever they want. Fortunately, we did get it amended a little bit to allow for the fees to be investigated at the commission. So that was a nice little win. And then it went up to the governor, and he vetoed it initially. So we were able to get a governor veto, which is great, but it's back. So it has now been bundled up into the omnibus bill. So another thing that's going on in the omnibus bill is the clause to destroy the Renewable Development Fund, and more importantly, the complete repeal of the Made in Minnesota program. So again, this was kind of an interesting thing in that it came before us and we had to go up and testify right away. What was a little victory is that the people who put it forward, which this case were Republicans, had sought to repeal the Made in Minnesota program before the lottery had taken place. And so the way that program works is every February you put in a whole bunch of applications for solar arrays. And then by April usually, the Department of Commerce selects who will win the lottery. And the Republicans had sought to stop this program before the lottery winners could be picked, which would have been incredibly detrimental. We would have lost probably 500 jobs in our industry if that had happened just immediately. Because so much of these companies had invested in this last year's cycle. I mean, I don't know if you've ever seen All Energy's billboards, but they put them everywhere. And they do it because they hope that they can fill the lottery up in February with projects. But if those projects had all been just eliminated, they would have wasted all that advertising money. And that would have crippled them. And so we did have that victory, though, of being able to slow it down. The Made in Minnesota program still exists. The lottery has been awarded. So at least that part came through. But this is in the omnibus bill as well. And the Made in Minnesota program pulls its money from something called the Renewable Development Fund, which is basically Xcel has to pay the state of Minnesota for its nuclear casks, I guess. And I think it's about $10 million per cask each year. And that money is supposed to be allocated to renewable development projects. And the initial proposal was to actually just get rid of the Renewable Development Fund and just allocate it to something called an energy fund, which would be the House and Senate would get to decide whatever type of energy project they'd like to fund that year, and then that's what would happen. It has now been changed slightly to basically pay off these pre-existing contracts that Xcel had with some biomass plants, which is kind of interesting. So basically, there was a renewable energy standard for biomass, like there was for solar. Xcel entered into some very expensive contracts. Whether or not that was their fault is subject to your opinion, I guess. But now they are trying to take the money from the Renewable Development Fund and pay off those contracts that they entered into. So basically they're trying to take the money from these casks, which they're supposed to pay to the state, and they're putting in this fund, and then they're giving it back to themselves to pay off for these biomass projects that they entered into.
Excuse me, would that does that mean that it will continue after that to not support new projects? I mean, right now the fund is supposed to support new energy, not stuff they've already done.
Correct. So one of the things about it is because of how much money the biomass projects will pull out, and because there are a few other things that we're expecting will pull out of the RDF or whatever it will be called. They're now calling it the COE fund for some reason. There won't be enough money for new projects, is what we're guessing. So basically, yeah, the RDF will be, in my opinion, like basically a sham at that point. But anyways, so then the PACE bill is also in the omnibus bill as well. This one we're less concerned about because at least there's going to be an opportunity for us to work with other stakeholders to try to convince them to put some consumer protections into place. Although right now we do have a PACE provider that's come to the state called Renovate America, and they have their own consumer protections already that they follow. And I'm confident that they do a great job if they were allowed just to proceed. So this legislation is also really slowing down the ability of people to go solar right now in state from PACE. And PACE also works for energy efficiency too, actually. The bulk of PACE financing is for just retrofitting your house. And then the last one in there that pertains to solar is, again, that small scale solar energy standard carve out adjustment I was talking about from 20 kW to 40 kW for Otter Tail and Minnesota Power. And again, we're neutral on this. Part of why is, as I talked about those renewable energy credits, since there's no alternative compliance penalty in state, Otter Tail has told us that their plan is to not actually put in any solar. What they're going to do is just buy solar credits from out of state to meet their compliance goals. And since there isn't any penalty if they don't, they might not even do that. So they told us if we let them do this, they try to build some more solar because then it meets their requirements a little bit better. And since they kind of can do whatever they, I mean, since the current situation is there's not going to be any solar, they're just going to buy credits, if that. We said, you know what, we'll try to give this a try. So that bill we're relatively neutral on. But as you can see, the omnibus bill, which is Senate File 1937, has some pretty disastrous things for solar in it. I mean, this alone will destroy 10 megawatts a year if it goes forward as is. A lot of people say that because the price of solar is dropping so much and the energy rates out in the cooperative service territories are increasing dramatically, that could be the next really big hotbed for solar. You don't even need many incentives if you can just net meter. But since they're doing these fees, they're making it basically impossible. So that could be hundreds of megawatts of solar, basically, that they're trying to get rid of. This PACE program slows and possibly just eliminates an entire subset of residential programs. And this last one might actually be slightly positive, but it also could be, it could be slightly bad. So what I would do is I would urge you guys to call or write your representative today about this. Tell them that you don't like Senate File 1937, the Energy Omnibus Bill. It hasn't been heard. We thought it was going to get heard today, but since today's Thursday, it'll probably be heard on Monday. So you still have a little bit of time. And tell your senator, tell your representative, and what I would suggest you do right now, or perhaps right after this, is call the governor directly. We're fairly confident we're going to get a veto on this initial omnibus bill. The question is what happens after that. And so it's really important to get individual constituents to come in and say specifically what they don't like about the omnibus bill. Solar is just one small part of it. There's all sorts of terrible things in there. Pretty much every part of the renewable energy economy has some sort of negative aspect about it. But it'd be really important to have you guys call in to discuss the solar specific parts.
Do you need to get a live person on the phone, or do you have to leave a message is okay too?
Leaving a message is great. I don't think I've ever gotten a live person when I've tried, so I've always left a message and and it works just fine. You can also write. I didn't add the governor's address for it because calling is just easiest. So that's what I would encourage you guys to do. And then lastly, one of the great parts about events like this is I get to tell you all about it, and then hopefully after this you will go to other places and tell more people about it, because we really got to get the grassroots effort on this going so we can make sure that these individual solar policies are excluded from this omnibus bill, because something's going to have to get passed. I just hope it doesn't have any anti-solar provisions.
Do we have a copy of your PowerPoint?
Yes, you can. Yeah, I think
Oh, cool.
Rich has some. And you had a question?
Is this specifically an energy omnibus bill or omnibus bill for like everything?
So it is, I would say it's specifically an energy omnibus bill, but it's called like the Energy, Jobs, and like Affordability Omnibus bill. So there's some other job stuff, like, I can't remember, there at some point there was some sort of like big $60 million grant for like shrimp farming somewhere. So it's all sorts of different stuff. I don't know if that's something like that. Yeah.
So is the governor's thing on the buffers, is that part of this bill?
No, the buffers would be a omnibus bill out of the environmental committee. Yep.
I understood, why 2 years ago when I got advocated for the Renewable Development Fund, but I don't understand the premise behind why it's so essential today. Why do you think it's so essential?
I think that's a good question. So I don't necessarily think that it's essential, but I do believe that it was sort of a contract that Excel made with the tribes, which is part of it, and sort of the state of Minnesota, that said if you're going to do nuclear power in this state, this is the cost of compliance. And so to me, it's sort of like just, how the value of solar I was talking about, like has all the appropriate values that solar provides to ratepayers, society, and the utility? Well, to me, there should be a different value of every energy type. And part of the value of nuclear energy is that it produces spent fuel rods, and those are negative value that aren't appropriately captured in an avoided cost pricing. And so to me, the Renewable Development Fund is just one way to sort of capture that externality. And so I don't necessarily think it's essential, I just think it's fair economics.
I think it was also related to the national level where the federal government said they were going to take the waste, and then that never happened, and then this was like a workaround that the state worked out with the utilities.
Yeah, and I think that is why it's still currently in place. And I know it has an end date. I believe it's like 2031 or something like that. And so perhaps it's no longer, maybe it's necessary today still for whatever reason, but it does have a phase out at some point.
I guess my question is, how is it so detrimental to solar? Why is it so essential to solar?
Oh, so it's essential to us. So it's not really the fund itself that is essential to us. It's that the fund pays for Made in Minnesota. And so if you got rid of the Renewable Development Fund and spent it all on something else, Made in Minnesota would get no money. And so if they had it be the energy fund, but it's still paid out Made in Minnesota, I think we as an industry would be fine with it. We know though that the governor cares about the Renewable Development Fund, and a lot of the constituents do, so we would never openly advocate for a transition to the new energy fund or the new Sea-Leaf fund, whatever they want to call it, even if we're still getting the same amount. Yeah.
Who determines, or what are the criteria for determining the credits assigned to the SREC?
So,
I've never heard of that, and I think it sounds like a really interesting idea and jam-packed with potential for what that, like kind of what you were just talking about, the value and the negative value of nuclear fuel rods, spent rods. That's negative Shreks.
yeah.
And because, anyway, what do you say to that?
So I think it's every 1,000 kilowatt hours generates one SREC. And
1,000 kilowatts.
Yep, so a megawatt hour that you produce is equivalent of one SREC. And its value from this is derived from kind of the political landscape. And so I guess SRECs weren't really the first credit. I think the first credit might have been like sulfur dioxide, something like that, back when acid rain was big. They tried to do a credit system. And when you hear about carbon capture, that's also like kind of a credit system. And the idea is that you can say that we're going to have only this amount of credits that are allowed, and then if you, how best to say this? So like maybe every polluter has to have a certain amount of credits, and if they don't have that amount of credits, they have to pay a huge fine, which then drives up the price of each individual credit. And that's sort of the same thing with the renewable energy credit. So like if you want to have a renewable energy standard that says you want 20% of your energy by wind, then the utilities are going to have to track their credits, right? And if they don't have enough, then what's the penalty? If the penalty is really high, then those utilities really want to get those credits, and that'll drive up the price. And so in Minnesota, we see SREC prices that are about 3 cents per kilowatt hour. They're really low. Out in like New Jersey, where they have a really tough alternative compliance penalty, it can be 30 or 60 cents per kilowatt hour. And then in Washington, D.C., it's like a couple dollars or something like that. It's actually really, really high. And that alone can spur an entire market. And so they're called like SREC markets, pretty much. I don't know if I explained that super well, but.
Well, yeah, I think so. I mean, it's sort of like so much solar to put so many cars off the road, or EVs, gas, what the damage it does to the environment, and how do you put a price on that?
Yeah. So there are other measures for that too.
And health.
Yeah.
What sorts of things have those states with the high SREC values done to enforce the penalty?
So a successful SREC market kind of requires, so first of all, it requires a trading system. You have to be able to get these RECs from the producers to the utility. You also need to have a fairly high renewable energy standard. So if you have a really easy to accomplish renewable energy standard, then the supply of the RECs will outweigh the demand. So there's that. And then you need to have a high alternative compliance penalty, which then steers the pricing. And so what you'll do is you'll often have the agency in control set that compliance penalty based on the statute. And so often states, kind of the way legislation works usually is, legislators don't know a ton about the details of a particular issue. They'll just sort of assign an agency to go figure it out. And so that's usually what these other states have done. They'll say, I don't know exactly what the alternative compliance penalty should be, but Department of Commerce, you go tell me what it should be. And if the Department of Commerce is feeling like they really want to drive up the price of RECs, they'll set a really high compliance penalty.
Why would the PUC limit community solar gardens if they already have, 25% by 2025? They're already trying to get to a certain limit. Why would they limit themselves by the amount of RECs they can buy from community solar gardens?
Sure. So that program has a very interesting story. So the statute says community solar gardens can only be 1 megawatt. So I use kind of an abbreviated way to talk about this, and I'll explain it. So the statute says they can only be 1 megawatt. Well, SunEdison, which is a company that I don't even know if they're still around, but they were huge. They came to Minnesota and argued before our Public Utilities Commission, all right, we accept that these gardens can only be 1 megawatt. What if we take this 1 megawatt garden and put it right next to another 1 megawatt garden? We can save on infrastructure that way, and it's kind of like we're doing 2 megawatts, but we'll have separate fences, so they'll be individual. Different lines will go out to each one. And so it's not that the commission allowed 5 megawatt ones, it's that they allowed you to co-locate up to 5. And then they only did it on the 1. And so you might ask, well, why? So right after SunEdison did this, we opened up the queue for applications. Well, some people actually just said, you know what, I'm going to do 50 1-megawatt gardens right next to each other down in Marshall or something. And they got so many applications from this that the commission said, all right, this is getting a little bit too crazy. This is not what we meant. We thought you might just put 1 or 2 by each other, but this is going to have some significant ratepayer impacts. And so the commission said, all right, you got to trim your 50 megawatt gardens down to 5. And then after that, we don't like what SunEdison did, so no one can co-locate anymore. And so then they left it down at 1, and now it's at 1 forever. The statute also required that you transition from the applicable retail rate, which is a higher rate, to the value of solar after 3 years. So that's why that happens.
Are the cooperatives and the municipal utilities still exempt from the renewable energy standard?
I believe that they are. I don't know about Great River Energy though. So there's different types of cooperatives and municipals. There's like distribution ones that are kind of the small ones that people interact with, and then there's generations and transmission ones which are bigger, and those ones are typically more regulated. I don't know about those though.
But the MLUs will always get slammed. I know they're required to fulfill it, but nothing's ever been said, I don't think, about the cooperative and municipal. I just wonder if you guys have a position on that, saying they should be included in the renewable energy standard as well.
I would love to, but they are really hard to push back against. And the reason is that they are in a lot of rural areas where voters are typically already going for Republican candidates, and a Democratic governor is loath to go against the wishes of the people out there because he doesn't want to look like he's forcing his metropolitan viewpoints on the people of rural Minnesota. And so they've been very difficult to pin down and to fight back against for that sort of political aspect, but we by all means would love for them to be included in it. I mean, everything that they're trying to do I don't think is right or just. I mean, a lot of what I do too is representing individual customers that have issues with their utilities, and I've seen some just nightmare scenarios, and they might even get away with it all. So I think it's atrocious myself.
Can you just say what that was that he was asking about?
Yeah, he was asking about whether the cooperatives and municipal utilities should be required to be a part of the renewable energy standard in Minnesota.
We're not right now.
I don't believe so.
You mentioned the change from ARR to VOS, and right now VOS isn't financially viable, I don't think, for residential.
Sure.
And Department of Commerce, PUC, they're sort of trying to reprice residential because for 2017 on gardens. How do you think that's going to play out, and will residential gardens be financially viable?
So,
What was the question exactly?
yeah, so the question is effectively the value of solar, which is the VOS, is lower than the applicable retail rate. And the VOS is one flat rate. The applicable retail rate is actually 9 different rates. It's like a tiered rate system. And so if you are a residential customer and you want to do a garden that services residential customers, you get a much higher rate than someone who wants to do a commercial rate. The value of solar, though, is just one flat rate. And so what it encourages developers to do is find as few subscribers as possible. So subscribers are expensive. If you want to have 100 different residential subscribers in your garden, you have to spend money to get them. You have to spend money to maintain them. If somebody moves out of your service territory, you have to spend money to make that change and correction. It's very expensive. And then there's extra risk too. I mean, if you have like Ecolab as one of your subscribers in your garden, that's a big, you can be pretty sure that entity is going to be around for a long time. But if you're trying to service a residential class, they might not be there. So there's a lot of risks associated with it, and a one flat value solar rate does not accommodate residential gardens, especially at its currently really low rate. And so what he was asking about is the Department of Commerce recently suggested maybe you should have an incentive on top of the value solar rate for residential customers. And he was also asking, I guess, will that work? And what do we think about it? And I would say, So I was writing those comments earlier today, actually, what our viewpoint is on that. We think that the 2.5 cent adder that they've suggested will hopefully be enough of an incentive to encourage residential gardens. The problem with the Department of Commerce's recommendation, though, is it starts at 2.5 cents, but then decreases over time. And we would like to see the 2.5 cents held static. And the thing that's really weird about the Department of Commerce's recommendation is it doesn't really provide any justification for the decrease over time. I mean, it's just always going to be the case that residential subscribers are more expensive than individual corporate subscribers. So I don't know why it would decrease down to 0 over time. That doesn't make any sense to me.
So I suppose they think it will become, over time, the mathematics, the calculations will change as the cost of solar comes down, maybe.
I just don't see that. It's still always going to be cheaper to have fewer subscribers than more. And so, like, even if it is viable for people to do it, you're basically asking a developer to decide whether they want to make money or make more money. And they're always going to choose to make more money. So I don't think a single flat rate can ever, this answer's going to go way in the weeds. I don't think a single flat rate can ever accommodate residential gardens unless competition for the high commercial subscribers gets so difficult and so tight that it somehow becomes cheaper to start marketing the residential rate. And to me, that's like never going to happen.
Well, didn't the 2030 legislation say that the gardens had to be financially viable?
It does, and so but it doesn't really say for who or for what, and it just says you have to be able to create or finance community solar gardens and make them accessible. It also doesn't say accessible for who. So you could argue that the commission's fulfilling its obligations currently. We would argue that, I want to see a whole different diverse class of subscribers. So I think that I think the applicable retail rate was actually really great in the sense that it provided for this diverse array of subscribers. I'd like to see similar incentives tacked on top of the value of solar to encourage that. Sure. Probably one more question.
Can you say like what the value would be right now? Or and what the top and the bottom of the 9 rates would be for the applicable one? Can you ballpark?
Yeah, I think the residential one was about 15 cents, pretty close to it. And the commercial, yeah, 15 cents per kilowatt hour produced. And then the other one was like 10 cents for commercial industrial. And so the value of solar right now is about 10 cents. It's about the same as the applicable retail rates commercial industrial level was. But so Excel recently published its 2016 report. Only about 20% of the gardens, I think, were residential. Even with that 15% or 15 cent rate. So going to a 12.5 cent rate is probably not going to yield that many residential gardens.
So then it used to be 15, but it's going to change to 12.5. It's what?
It used to be 15, now it's at 10. It might be 12.5.
And the reason it went down to 10 was because they felt the value of solar wasn't that much.
It went down to, so the statute required that eventually you move from the applicable retail rate to the value of solar. That's why it's down there now.
So the value is really supposed to be is 10. The Commerce Department thinks the value of solar is 10 cents. Is what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. And the applicable rate, the tie can go from 15 to, you said 9 different rates?
Yeah, so it's complicated, but it's like a really complicated rate system based on like your specific customer class and like the size of your garden. And then there's something else in there too that I never really figured out.
Well, the applicable rate now, that's the rate that you get if you put solar on top of your house? Or that's a different?
Well, that's a different one. So
another rate.
Yeah. So there's
All complicated.
there's the applicable retail rate, which only applies to community solar.
All right.
But then there's a different ARR, which is the average retail rate. And that's what you get on your house. And that is, if you were to take all of your utilities retail rates, blend them together and average them. That's what you get paid out for your energy you produce in excess of what you consume.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I think it's 7 o'clock. If you have any extra questions, I'll be around for a little bit longer.